Uh, there we are. Okay. Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to History Matters, and so does today, really strong coffee. It's getting to the end of the semester, so I'm thinking we all need really strong coffee. Um, Today, we are going to be discussing othering in a variety of ways. But before I talk about othering, I shall turn for the moment to my partner in crime, Grace, who will explain the rules of the game before we begin.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Grace Leatherman with the National Council for History Education, and we are so delighted that you could be with us here on History Matters, and so does Coffee, the 106th episode with Joanne Freeman. As always, Joanne, we're so grateful that you can be with us every Friday to help make sense of the world through the lens of history. It's so important. We do hope that if you enjoy this, you'll check out our other offerings at ncheteach.org. We've got a lot of wonderful things coming up. We just had a wonderful webinar last night, and we've got lots more events coming up this spring and summer, so do check that out. Please participate today. Make sure that you are participating in the chat. It's always an active community here. But if there's a question that you'd like me to see to ask Joanne, please put it in the Q&A so that I make sure that I do see that. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it back to Joanne. Thanks, Joanne.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so as indicated a moment ago, we're going to be talking about othering, which in some ways is sadly a really obvious topic to be discussing these days, particularly given the Don't Say Gay Florida bill, which is front and center, but there are so many ways in which people are being othered right now. And I wanted to talk about this partly because I think it's tempting on the one hand to assume that things that are happening now have never happened before. On the other hand, it's tempting to assume that what's happening now is normal. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those assumptions and why they're not quite right. But as ever, before I begin, as a historian, I want to throw out into the History Matters sphere some basic definitions, some basic terms, so that we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about here. So I did find a useful piece of scholarship, really kind of just laying out in basic terms categories of othering, ways of thinking about othering, which I offer. The woman, the scholar who did this is named Dr. Beverly Tatum, Tatum. She's a clinical psychologist. She does a lot of work on race relations. And so she lays out in her work these categories of othering, ways in which you can essentially, and actually before I even say how you other, this is what othering is. Highlighting differences between groups of people to increase suspicion of them, to insult them or exclude them. That is othering. Obviously, there are a number of reasons why one might do that. And basically, there are two steps to that. This is not Beverly Tatum. I'm going to come back to her in a moment. But the first step is categorizing a group of people according to perceived differences. And I'll come to this in a moment, such as ethnicity, skin color, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. Step one. Step two, I've now become my student with the phone going off in the middle of my lecture. Step two is identifying that group as inferior and then using an us versus them mentality to alienate that group. And although this is not pulled from what I found online, I will add to that, to alienate the group and unite the people who are doing the alienation around that hate. So that's othering. Beverly Tatum has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories of othering. There's probably more, but these are hers. You can other people based on race or ethnicity. You can other them based on gender. You can other them based on religion, based on sexual orientation, based on socioeconomic status, based on age, or based on physical or mental ability. So obviously, those are all ways in which you can declare people different and other, and along with that, inferior, and in some way or another, either to be cast aside or excluded or acted against. And by doing that, part of the goal of that is to unite people behind that othering And also, as I'm going to talk about today, it's a very obvious, logical, and hateful, but still obvious and logical way to deal with people who feel that their power is threatened, right? If you feel somehow or other that your dominance or your power is threatened, how handy it can be to declare some people others, particularly people who you feel threatened by, declare them others, try to make them inferiors, and then push them out of the way. So the logic of that, as ugly as it is, there is a logic to that. Nowadays, obviously, we're seeing this on a lot of fronts. One of the ones that happens to be, oh, my phone. One of the ones that happens to be front and center right now is branding anything that has to do with gender and sexual orientation along lines that some people declare as not normal by their standards, having something to do with pedophilia, right? Everyone's a pedophile who doesn't agree with what this one category of person thinks. That's the most obvious at the moment. One of the most obvious modes of othering is just like, yeah, whatever you think, if I don't like it, then as far as gender, sexual orientation is concerned, that means you're a pedophile. Obviously, that's wrong and ugly and strategic for political purposes. Othering people to unite people around the idea that their political opposition, people who don't agree with them, people who are threatening their hold on dominance or power are an other, are threatening other, are a criminal other. All of that is bound up in that kind of homophobic, ugly othering. We see that going on, obviously, for a long time, but also now in the mix, race and religion, right? Othering people on the race, and we could burrow into all of the weird ways in which people are trying to control conversation around racial issues in schools, ways in which people are implying, and I can't even remember what I saw yesterday. It was implying and actually ultimately saying just outright that people of particular races are more likely to be criminals than other people, which is just as crazy and ugly as declaring that a whole category of people must be pedophiles. I mean, it's when you say it out loud in this way, it sounds as crazy as it is. The fact that it's so obviously beyond wrongheaded, I can't even find the words to describe it. And yet it's part of our rhetoric right now, and people are buying into it, is ugly and is frightening. Obviously, anti-Semitism, just like racism, long-standing, and actually anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, all of these sort of things that are going on right now. On the one hand, they are racism. On the one hand, they have a long tradition. On the other hand, they're also part of this pattern of othering people strategically, politically, at a moment when people who feel that they either have power or deserve power are feeling threatened and are grabbing at these kinds of tools to keep a grip on power, to keep themselves in control, to other their opposition out of the sphere of normal politics, to basically criminalize in one way or another all of these other people, casting them aside, and thus allowing these people who feel that they are entitled to power to maintain their hold on power. Now, it is not going to be surprising for me to say that there's a long history in the United States of people using that kind of logic, particularly people who are afraid of losing power, or are in the process of losing power, to use that kind of logic to grip it, to hang on to it, to push out others who are stepping forward to assert their rights, and their rights to have a say, their rights to have rights, right? That are in one way or another, by people stepping forward to assert themselves, people who are already there and feel entitled to power, Those are the people they're going to want to push aside. And there's a long-standing history of this. And a lot of what I say here is not going to be shocking, but I felt the need to bring it together here to highlight the ways in which othering is broader than racism. Othering occurs throughout American history. And as I said at the outset, on the one hand, it's happened for a long time. On the other hand, some of the ways in which it's happening now are, I don't want to say new, because as a historian, you can always find roots, but are not as traditional as they're being depicted. So let me offer a few examples of othering in the past, and then I want to come back to this way in which some things that people are declaring traditional right now are not so traditional. Obviously, look over the long haul of American history, and you can see othering of immigrants, of people coming into the country. And I say at the outset here, although people were othering other people in part because of a fear of losing jobs, I am not sitting here and saying it's all economic. It's all economic anxiety leads to this behavior. No, it does have to do with power and entitlement, right? Your sense of your own power and your sense of entitlement to that power and your sense of threat at others that seem to question it. So in the late 18th century, there was a good amount of othering of immigrants of various sorts. In the early 19th century, that becomes more focused on the Irish. In the late 18th century, it's a little bit more widespread than that. There's some German, I don't even know what to call it, othering in the late 18th century as well. In one way or another, the Irish particularly being declared another race, right? The Irish are in some ways just that they use race to other the Irish. In all of those cases, it has to do with Americans feeling that there are people coming into the country and taking whatever, you could say jobs, you could say power, but taking what these people feel entitled to, which in one way or another is dominance and control, and they like the way things have been, and they are protesting against change by othering people who are potentially bringing change with them. Now, many moons ago, I read a book in grad school. Haven't thought about it for a long time, and I thought about it thinking about today's episode. It's by T.H. Breen and Steve Innes. It's called Mine Own Ground. I used to jokingly refer to it as Miney Oni Groundy because it's written in sort of 17th century with the E at the end, OWNE. But what's interesting about this book, apart from my silliness in the way that I somehow have it in my head, it talks about Virginia's eastern shore in the mid 17th century and then up to the late 17th century. And it shows how in that area, in the eastern shore, that there were Black people who basically maintained or achieved some level of rough equality with their poor white neighbors. That it wasn't as though, we look back to the past and assume that, of course, all Black people, and particularly anyone from Africa, was instantly deemed enslaved or should be enslaved and an inferior. There was a little bit of, it was a little bit more amorphous on the Eastern Shore for a couple of decades in the 17th century, that you had Africans, some of them coming enslaved to that area and then achieving their freedom, being able to use the courts in the way that white people could have used the courts in that time, sometimes themselves, even in purchasing slaves. That, in other words, there's this little window on the Eastern Shore in which things are different from how we might assume they could ever be in this early time period. That the logic, the othering that we assume is always the case in terms of race was not necessarily operating in that way. Again, during a small window of time on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. But the point of that is that we shouldn't take othering for granted. We shouldn't assume that it's the norm, it's the of course. It has become an of course, but that isn't necessarily true, right? I mean, it's dangerous to assume that othering, of course, it's going to happen, because in a sense that removes the possibility for other possibilities, right? So I bring up mine own ground, mine only groundy, just to remind us that othering takes different forms and shapes, is not always in American history in the same way. And what that book shows at the end is the ways in which a more familiar mode of othering comes into play at the very end of the 17th century, when people begin to, partly because there are more and more people coming directly from Africa who seem foreign to the Eastern Shore, that some of these freedoms that are achieved by Black people in Virginia at that point are taken away, because now there's more of an other, a sense of an other. Rights are stripped away, and Virginia moves into a different mode, a different period. You could use the same kind of logic thinking about gender and sexual orientation. If you have more interest in this, actually, I will point you, someone's going to get bingo. I will point you to the podcast that Heather Cox Richardson and I did this last week on questions of gender and sexual orientation. One of the things that we found in our research and discussed is that, people nowadays people on the right nowadays asserting that traditional values are being attacked and that they need to defend traditional values by othering people who have choices as far as gender or sexual orientation that these folks don't like. They're not traditional. What's traditional is men and women being married. That's what a marriage is, and men are men and women are women, and that's the way it should be. Well, when you look over the long haul of American history, part of what you find is that that's not always true, right? That what is actually traditional is that there was more fluidity in the past, which is not to say that people who made different choices about their gender or sexual orientation had it easy in the past and suddenly it's become hard. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am saying is the past wasn't one uniform block as far as how people felt about these issues. And there were moments in time, areas certainly, where there was somewhat more acceptance among some people, a more fluid sense of who people could be, less of a sense of, drawing straight lines and declaring people on one side of the line are good and people on the other side of the line are others. So that the larger point that Heather and I made this past week in our podcast was, if you're talking about traditions regarding gender, traditions aren't these are men and these are women and that's it. That's not traditionally always the case in the United States, has not been. And so tradition in that sense is being used to say this is what we want, and we're going to declare it's always been the case. We're going to declare it's always been true. Hasn't necessarily been. There are options. There have been changes over time. These sorts of things are malleable and are strategically deployed at key moments when people who feel entitled to power feel threatened, feel that power is being threatened. That's, in a sense, what we're seeing now. I've talked about it in another way in the past when I've talked about violence and bullying in politics, and I've discussed how, particularly in relation to my last book, what you see is Southerners being aggressively violent in a strategic way to silence their opposition because they feel threatened. They feel that their slave regime might be under attack. They feel that the South might not ultimately have the power that it has. And to maintain that power, they are going to use violence and they are going to depict Northerners as cowards and do any number of other things that they can do to push them aside so that they can maintain the power they feel entitled to. Othering is another way of doing that. And I think at the end of my comments, usually I do circle back to the present, which I will do now, to say, I think it's really important while this othering is happening to remember the fact that as much as people, and I just saw someone in chat say tradition, is precisely that, is to really think twice when people step forward and say, tradition, it's traditional American values. You're attacking traditional American values. If you have a historical sensibility, if you're willing to allow for the complexity of the past, if you actually understand and look at past events and changes over time in people's assumptions about national identity and what is American, what you see is that it's fluid. What you see is that there's change. What you see is that the things that people are asserting right now as eternals, as traditional, as things that must be maintained, they are being asserted that way, in that kind of unquestionable way, now, for purposes now. It's a way of depicting things now for political purpose now. It's what people do when they feel entitled to power and they feel threatened because other people seem to either be getting some power, getting some rights, or about to get some power, or about to get some rights. And that feels so threatening. You step forward and say, oh, no, they don't deserve any of that. They are others. That's the moment that we're in, right? And in any number of ways in past episodes of History Matters, I've talked about that very logic. You have people who feel entitled to rights and power and a certain kind of superiority, realizing that the demographics are not necessarily working in their favor, realizing that there are more and more people who have a sense of coming forward at this moment to assert their rights, and people who are going to support them, that you have even some generational sensibility about what's going on, that we're in a moment when things are up for debate that a certain sector of society feels should not be up for debate, that they should be set in stone. And they are saying, tradition, let's look to the past. This is how we define things. This is how we categorize things. Here is the us, and those are the them. Don't listen to them. They're not real Americans. They're dangerous. They're criminals. They need to be opposed. All of that is a way to assert dominance, but also, and obviously and dangerously, it's a way to criminalize opposition. And in a democracy, you don't criminalize the opposition. In a functioning democracy, that's what it's about, is competition, opposition, debate and compromise, or debate and no compromise. But in one way or another, democracy is about free and fair contests for power based on the popular will, based on free and fair elections. So if you are stepping forward and saying those who oppose us are illegitimate, are criminals, are bringing some weird new un-American thing into the picture and need to be cast out, by definition, if you're turning, and in this case, basically anyone who doesn't agree with them is falling into that category. Anyone who doesn't agree with the extreme right is falling into that category. It's obvious to say, but I have to say it. That's obviously not democracy, right? Which isn't to say you can't see people who have views that you consider criminal or ugly and state that and assert that. I'm not saying that. But if in doing that, you then add on to that, well, clearly they're not Americans and they have no right to say what they think, and thus, they're gone, they should be disappeared. That's a problem. I mean, we've seen that problem throughout American history where, the Ku Klux Klan is allowed to have rallies and their ideas are ugly, but they're allowed to do that because in a democracy, you're allowed to step forward and state your views, even if they're ugly and hateful. The step beyond that is, no, you're not allowed to state your views. You're not allowed to have those views. As a matter of fact, if you have those views, you're a dangerous other that needs to be cast aside. Such a dangerous way of thinking, such an obviously undemocratic way of thinking. The other thing that I noticed this week, and maybe I'll talk about it next week, but it's along the lines of something that's so obviously undemocratic that it is kind of stunning, is I believe it's the Republican National Committee has declared that Republican candidates can no longer take part in the traditional debates that we have before elections, that they should just not be part of that. What? I sent forth into the world a little tweet that basically said, in a democratic form of government, you have to earn a vote. And you earn it by explaining who you are to the American people who have a choice between candidates, right? That's a democracy, or a democratic mode of governance works by having an option of candidates. They appeal to the public, and the public decides what they want. If you are saying, yeah, we're no longer going to take part in those debates that have been going on for decades, that were created actually in a nonpartisan way, you're declaring that you no longer feel it important to stand up with your opponents and just address the American people. You're backing out of that system. That's remarkable to me. It's not surprising in a way, although it is. That's a long, I'm sort of veering off my focus, but my larger point here is, do not assume that some of the absolutes that you're hearing now, that some of the traditional talk, that some of the discussion of American values has a basis in long-standing tradition in American history. In the past, we've had different moments, sometimes more fluid moments, certainly changes over time, moments when that kind of talk and behavior and absolutism has been strong, and moments, opportunities when it hasn't been. So don't fall into the trap of assuming that what is being declared tradition, insiders and outsiders, us, we, the real Americans, and others, criminals and bad people, do not assume that that's eternal, or that there's any way in which that represents a long-standing, unquestioned historical truth, because it doesn't. It's a ploy. It's a political ploy, and it's using the idea and word tradition to other people in a really dangerous and undemocratic way. Okay, I see it's time for questions, and I'm out of time, and I got up on a soapbox there. Oh, okay, and I could see, actually, I get to close my notes now, which means I can actually see what people were saying, and I see mug. Okay, so I'm gonna do the mug. Oopsie, and I just spilled some coffee, that's good. I believe, and I apologize for not knowing this with great certainty, but I believe, Tom, is it you who gave me this mug? You will be able to tell me. I don't write these things down. I really did just spill my coffee. But it is the appropriate mug for the moment. History should make you uncomfortable, right? History is contingency. History is questions and change. History is insiders and outsiders changing over time. History is political ploys that are sometimes exposed as political ploys. History isn't shiny and pretty, and it shouldn't be. We should question history, and we should question politics. That is today's mug. Okay. And now I will continue to, I really did spill my coffee. Okay, I think it's better. Okay. An evergreen mug, sadly. Tom, was it you who gave me, I'm gonna open chat. Was it you who gave me that mug? And I apologize if it isn't.
Yes. Yes, it was.
It is. Okay, that's what I thought, but I felt horrible if it wasn't, someone was going to get slighted. So, okay. Okay.
And Joanne, I have to say, this is a topic that did not make for easy background finding.
I
doesn't
sure.
want pictures of people being othered, and
No, you don't
it's
want to.
tricky.
Yeah.
No. So I went with, this is actually a circus being set up in the 1920s. Because if you think about it, I mean, circuses in some way, particularly when the 1920s, were a professional othering show in
That's
many
true.
ways.
That is very
And
true. That is true. Okay, that was very creative, Grace.
well, I did sat there and I was like, oh no, this is
So sorry, I didn't think about that. I was thinking about it all week. Got my lipstick all over everything. I'm a mess this morning. I was thinking about it all week because of the gender episode that Heather and I did, and we thought about it and we talked about it. So it's been on my mind. And then I saw the basically Republicans saying, no, you can't take part in debates anymore. And I was like, yeah, we got to talk about othering and democracy. But really, honestly, the word tradition is dangerous in that way. So anyway, that was my larger my larger point. Beth figured it
Yeah, and
out.
actually,
Go
to your
ahead.
point about fluidity, we actually had a very interesting webinar last summer from History Unerased on gender fluidity in Jamestown, actually.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, among other things, but that was part of it. That actually, Kathleen, who works for us now, she presented it. So that is on our,
Oh,
I think it's our critical conversation series from last summer. If you're interested in
nice.
more of that idea of kind of shaking up the idea of what's traditional and what's not.
It's really fascinating, and it's, in a sense, it's kind of obvious when you put it out there like that, but it's really easy to not think about it.
Indeed. All right. Got a lot of questions. Do keep, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Oh, actually, Francesca wants to know, she actually has that very question. Could you expand a little bit? And I know you did this a bit in your podcast, but just expand a little bit on gender in the past and what you mean that that may not be as traditional as we think it is.
Yeah, no, and I will. And as I said before, and Heather and I did the episode, and then at the end we thought, and I think added in something. We were talking about fluidity. We were so pleased to discover fluidity in the past, and then we were like, ooh, we don't want to suggest that like it was all easy in the past. There was never any
Mhm.
opposition, which is really not true. But there's a book, for example, by Jen Mannion that came out in the last 2-3 years called Female Husbands, that talks about couples, people who, two women together, and one was a wife and one was a husband, and that they were accepted in society as that kind of a couple. There have been a number of books actually in the past that talk about, and sometimes this has to do with a community that knows these people and takes them as they are, and it's fine. And Female Husbands is an example of that, or just two people of the same gender choosing to be together as a couple. And when you read people commenting on it, they will say things like almost like a married couple, right? So they're accepted in one way or another. So basically, that's part of what I mean, is that there are people making different choices in the past that in some cases were accepted for having made those choices. Or we also talked about categorization, people trying to put people in boxes, that people engaged in behavior in the past that was not branded like, ooh, this is homosexual, all capital letters. That there were different ways in which men and women engaged, that didn't have that sort of stamp on it, so that this is bad, it's homosexual, that there were ways in which people engaged that were certainly in one way or another either acceptable or allowable, or not stamped down on and declared out of bounds in the way that they are now. So that's really what we talked about in the episode. We talked a little bit about Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence and that relationship. We talked about any number of other things that those relationships are complicated. Those people did not brand themselves with one word. People making different choices. And often that was just taken as is. There are moments when people start to categorize other people and put them in boxes. And those often are moments when people feel threatened. The Cold War, look at McCarthyism as an example of people being put in a box. This is bad, you're a bad person, comes at a moment when people feel that something they take for granted is being threatened. So that's the time to declare enemies, put people in boxes, like anything you feel could be dangerous to what you want is put out of bounds. So, it makes sense. And I've talked about this before too, about this moment in time. I've talked about how there are moments in American history when particularly I think people understand that certain basics about the United States are up for debate. And I've talked about the late 1790s, when really how democratic, small d, would this new country be? How did democracy work was up for debate, along with the French Revolution pegging into that. So the late 1790s are this nasty period with nasty politics and all kinds of accusations. The lead up to the Civil War is another one of those moments where slavery, the whole question of slavery, that's it. That's up for debate. People know it. And that becomes a moment where it becomes important to categorize people and draw lines and declare enemies. The Civil Rights era, too. same idea when suddenly you're drawing lines and categorizing people, and those kinds of moments are prone to violence, because once you've declared someone an enemy, you feel justified in some way or another about being violent towards them. And we're in that kind of moment now because I think people understand that there are some pretty conflicting views about what the United States is that are at war right now. The democracy itself is up for debate right now. And at a moment like that, particularly if you assume you're entitled to power, you're going to respond in this kind of a way, putting people in boxes, declaring them others, and in doing so, justifying violence against them. Which I realize is a dark message, but sometimes you got to go dark. Heather and I were like, whatever we talk about and record next week, let's make it a little bit less dark. It's like, come up a little bit so that it's not entirely dark.
That's tricky, but
it is tricky.
We're glad that you're here talking about things. Tom wants to know, is the Know Nothing movement a prime example of othering in U.S. history and politics?
The Know Nothing movement, a nativist movement. And it also, the Know Nothing movement touches on another longstanding tradition that I didn't go into, but that's anti-Catholicism. Mm-hmm. Also, very long tradition. Part of that being, or at least the justification for it being, well, Catholics are loyal to the Pope, right? They're not loyal to our government, and so they're suspect. So that's very long-standing anti-Catholicism. It ebbs and flows, and it's different in different places as well in the United States and in the colonies. It's not a constant, but the Know Nothings, ultimately the American Party, is partly anti-immigrant, partly anti-Catholic. And in both cases, the idea there is that these people are not loyal to America, are not loyal to the United States for either religious reasons, or as immigrants, they're bringing dangerous foreign ideas and they're loyal to foreign governments. It's the same kind of logic that people use against Jews to say that they're not loyal to America, right? When I won't use names, but when people choose to say, your country, Israel, right? That's not my country. I'm American. And I'm not loyal to another government in that way, but that's the sort of suggestion there, is that, well, Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States. So that's really their country. They're not real Americans. That's a really easy way of othering people, and seems, if you want to believe it, seems justifiable, because you can say, oh, but look, it's a government and they like that country. And, one of the tricks of othering is making it seem logical, justifiable, facts attached to it, so that as outrageous as it seems, you allow people who need to believe that to find a way to believe it, that they can see it's not based on hate. Heaven forbid, this is American tradition, standing up for America by believing this. No one wants to be called a racist and actually believe that they're racist. Some of them are. It's just a way of pretending that that's not the case.
Interesting. Well, we do have more questions about religion, as actually it's sort of a related question. So I'm kind of excited to see if these weave together. That Cece's noting.
Yeah. Oh, I saw Joe Lieberman appeared in the chat as far as religion goes. Mm-hmm. And actually,
yeah.
Just really quickly, and then we can go back to the questions. The interesting thing about Joe Lieberman coming forward as a vice presidential candidate was, on the one hand, I, as someone who's Jewish, right, I was like, wow, look at that. On the other hand, there were a lot of older Jews, and who then spread this, I think, among many Jews, who said in one way or another, this is bad for the Jews. Like, it's not going to go well, right? If a Jew steps forward and is going to be asserting power in that way, it's not going to be good for us, right? In some way or another, it's going to be bad. Another dimension of othering, right, is the people who are being othered and are accustomed to being othered can see it coming, and even though it appears to be stepping outside of that box, you can see the tradition of othering coming into view.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. Well, Cece notes that she was always taught that, America is a land founded on the principles of religious freedom. But in fact, if you look at the Puritans, they are not. They're even executing people who are not
Well, and
who
casting
they
them
see as
out.
religious
Where do we get Rhode Island and Connecticut, right? Dissenters.
Yep.
So it's another example like tradition, right? Religious freedom that needs to be interrogated, that needs to be thought about and investigated and understood in its complexity. I was joking with my graduate students this past week, and we were talking about how the ease with which you can step forward and make these sort of absolute claims like this, and that historians who want to intervene in that kind of conversation, it's not easy to step into that kind of conversation and say, actually, it's complicated. No one wants to hear that, right? No one wants to be like, really, tell me how it's complicated. It's very hard to step in and convincingly persuade people when that's the truth, but that's where you're starting.
And on that, so Cece wants to know, I don't know, was there a moment when Americans started, I don't know, was there, I'm trying, I think she's got a couple of different ideas and I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly, but was there a shift between the early 17th and late 18th century, she's saying, where, I don't know, people started seeing this as a country of religious toleration, or is this just kind of a myth we've built up, or is this in pockets?
I think, well, okay, so several answers. I think Americans have at different moments have a broad sense of what the United States stands for. And I think that can exist at the same time that on a real life grounded level, it's not so clear, right? So that we can, and you can see it now, right? People, America, the land of freedom, the land of opportunity, the land of, like, fill in the sort of sweeping generalizations that people make about the United States. And sometimes those very same people are the people who are saying, well, you don't deserve that opportunity and you don't deserve that opportunity. And so that there's a sort of mythologized, sweeping, generalized way of talking about the United States that's sort of wrapped up in a little ribbon of nationalism and exceptionalism. And you can talk that talk while operating on a really different level on the ground, which is precisely why, as I've said any number of times on History Matters, you have to interrogate the words, you have to interrogate the rhetoric, you have to think about the reality of it, you have to think about who's saying it, you have to pierce below the words to get at the reality, because sometimes the words are there just for effect and not for meaning. And it's, I mean, there's so many people here, history teachers here, right? That's one of the big challenges. I mean, I think about it all the time in teaching early American history is, on the one hand, I want students to not, I think I've mentioned here, I tell my students they cannot write in what I call democracy speak. And by that, I mean writing essays about early America or America and saying, liberty, freedom, America, democracy, and sort of tossing around those kinds of words and ideas without grounding them at all in fact or reality, which is not to say that those things don't exist or that we shouldn't discuss them, but it's really easy to talk about that stuff because those are American words and that's the story of America. And it's meaningless. Democracy, freedom, liberty. And that doesn't tell you much about the founding, right? I mean, we've talked here, we've had conversations before about how when you teach the founding, on the one hand, it's worth noting the ideas and the ideals that were birthed at that moment. It's also vital to note that all of the ways in which they were not either taken seriously or achieved. And I think you can't do one without the other. And people who are saying, let's just focus on ideals because they're important, and are casting aside anything that they determine ugly, you thus have made it impossible to understand those ideas and ideals because they weren't born in isolation. They were born in this other climate. So anyway, I know I'm talking big and small at the same time, but I think that's kind of what you have to do when you're talking about these kinds of broad declarations and the implications that go along with them.
We've got a couple of people who are asking, oh, there's so many good questions. I want to get at this in the
It's a
right
big
way.
topic, right? It's a big topic.
It is. There's so much good stuff here. Um, let's see. All right, we'll jump into. So Carol Lee wants to know the best way to combat othering, and Tiffany wants to know, are there historically effective ways to reduce othering? So sort of the same question.
Interesting. Wow, I hadn't thought about that before. Other ways, like ways to combat it. Well, this is not at all a sweeping answer, but it's something that surprised me that on a personal level. So and whenever I talk about Twitter, I feel like a total goofball, like serious historians shouldn't be on Twitter, but it's a teaching tool. At any rate, there are a good number of people who follow me on Twitter who really don't agree with my politics. And I like that. And sometimes I'm even able to, we can engage in a dialogue, and that's encouraging. But there was a case in which there was someone who I had friendly engagement with about other things, among other things about birds. And yet this person was always stepping forward and saying really horrible things about people on the left. And so finally at one point, I said, do you really think that about me? Like all of those things you're saying about the left, I'm on the left. Like, do you think I'm really that horrible? And he said, no, you're not. And I said, well, then why are you, and we actually had a moment where he kind of had to say, well, I'm just doing that to get people upset. Like, okay, well, I don't know if that person changed their behavior, but again, this is a very small answer to a very big question. Sometimes stepping forward with something personal or immediate, I'm standing in front of you. Do you really? Actually, I heard many, like years ago, someone, I guess maybe it was on NPR, or I can't remember where it was. Someone who was on, they were having these recorded conversations between people on the extreme left and the extreme right. And initially, in one of these early conversations, the person who beamed in from the extreme right came on like really angry and with a bunch of accusations, you commie, blah, 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 blah. And the person on the left said, actually, I am a communist. And I'd be happy to talk about what that means. But in a way, you're kind of right. Ultimately, the two people ended up having a conversation, like a real conversation. So sometimes, again, this is not a systemic answer. This is not going to solve any problems, but it has been uniformly surprising to me when you force the conversation out of that broad level and bring it down to earth. Sometimes that can have an impact. It's like I said, a very small answer to a very big question, but it surprises me every time because the vitriol is so big and angry, and the hate feels so big and angry. And the fact that you can ask a little question, really, like, you've been following me for years, and I never thought of myself as an evil, horrible communist trying to destroy America. Like, well, you're not. Oh, okay, like, let's talk about that. I don't have a big answer to that question. I think it's a really important question. But I think it's hard to have a big answer. I do think part of the answer does have to do with not staying up in the sphere of big, broad, sweeping claims that are kind of, on the one hand, easy to accept and easy to not think about and can have a big impact. That's not satisfactory, but I don't have an easy answer to that. I know there are lots of programs out in the world that I read about from time to time that have to do on a community level with bringing people together in communities who traditionally hate each other and getting them involved in a conversation and doing a version of just what I said, which is teaching them like, oh, actually, you're like a real person. And I now have to kind of rethink what I'm thinking. But it's why I do think change starts from the bottom up. I do think ground level grassroots things, I do think local office, I do think localized political movements that's the way that you really get meaningful change, not necessarily big top-down efforts. Traditionally in American history, grassroots organizations have a real power, and I think it's because they're small and they're local and people know each other and they have to engage with ideas and with each other and with conflict in a different kind of a way.
Well, thank you. This is very interesting. And again, we've got kind of some questions related to this. So Kathleen was recently listening to Tina Rosenberg, an American journalist, talking about people who may not feel represented in the media, who may be then driven to more extreme sources of media, where some of this sort of top-down othering is taking place. So Kathleen is wondering that sometimes people doing the othering may in fact feel othered themselves in some way,
right.
and may feel very isolated, and that may be where some of this is coming from. And she's wondering if in history there are times when there are people who may be acting out in an extreme way to others because they feel isolated or disempowered themselves. Are there examples in history of groups being brought back in, of othering being reversed in some way? I mean, I think that's sort of going to what you were just saying, that perhaps this is community ground up. But do we have any examples in history of these tense moments where there is this extreme othering happening, fractioning of groups? Can that be reversed? Do we have any examples of this?
This is probably not exactly what's being asked about, but it's the first thing that pops into my mind, which has to do with Salem and the witch trials, right? So that you get a group of people, and sometimes it's older women, and sometimes, there's so many books about what led to maybe that extreme othering, about declaring people witches and then worthy of being killed. But what's interesting about that is eventually over time, it becomes so extreme, and so many local community members that people actually saw as being part of the community are being pinpointed, that people back away, right? So that you actually see people stepping forward and saying that like maybe we've gone too far, maybe we need to rein this back in. It's not a case in which people are like, this is wrong and we should stop it. There's not like a dramatic conversion, but it does show that at a certain point, it is possible for people to see that what they're doing is beyond, has crossed a line. It's not just othering, but it actually is coming to be seen like a deliberate murdering of people for not entirely clear reasons. So, there is a point at which the anti-witch moment in Salem calms down. And part of that is a little bit of a sense of shame at what was happening, and the fact that it was not well grounded, in reality, that there was some component of it that became other. You're an other. You're an older woman who's unmarried, other. You're someone who lives on the edge of town, other. Whatever the thing was that distinguished some of these people who were accused of being witches. If some people could get to the point where they understood some of this was othering and not grounded on actual important difference, maybe there becomes at least a little bit of a consciousness that it's not quite right. Now, that's not an entirely satisfactory answer, because there's no solution. It's like, well, sooner or later, people get so ashamed of themselves that they back away. But that was extreme othering. And, it's interesting, and I didn't think about this before, but it would be interesting to go find, I throw this out there to everyone who's watching, to go find some of the language and thought of the people in that moment when people pull it back in, and to see what they say about what they did, and why they are stopping it. It would be interesting to see what kind of consciousness they have and how they brand what they did, and how they understand it. I don't remember what that rhetoric is off the top of my head, but that would be really interesting to look at and see.
I am so impressed that you nailed that with an early American example.
I don't know where that came from, but thank you, John.
That was
Actually, where
perfect.
that came from was the coffee, is where that came from. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, anyway, I guess we're kind of out of time. I do want to, let me come back to this while we're closing things off. There was a statement. There we go. Carolee made a statement. Someone got bingo because I know Carolee's name always ends up on the bingo card. As always, as we come to the end of this session, I want to thank you all for coming together here and engaging in democracy on a Friday morning, having these kinds of conversations that matter, asking difficult questions that don't always have answers or obvious answers, and working through that together, being a community that can have these kinds of conversations. What I wanted to quote was Carolee, who said a little bit back, "Thanks, friends, glad we can all be human together in this space and out of this space." And that's part of the community that I really feel we have here, is that it's an accepting community, and we don't know everything, and we know we don't know everything, and we're willing to work it out together and come together in this space in a friendly way and really ask hard questions. And that matters. Even it might not feel like it matters. It might feel like there's not enough of us here for it to matter. It matters because everyone leaves this sphere and encounters all of the other people in the arc of your life. And you take this awareness and you take this consciousness and you take this knowledge with you into your life. And ideally you bring it to others. And that matters. I think that matters. So as ever, I thank you for being here and engaging in this democratic process. Now, I will also say, because it must be said, that what we now do at this moment, as the episode comes to a close, is we will move into the after party. Those of you who are new, what that means is if you've beamed in here online, just through the NCHE website, stay right where you are, and poof, we will be the after party. And all that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on, so we can have a little bit more of a free conversation. If you have beamed in through Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and come in, join us through ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. And I will let you, Grace, if you want to have an NCHE closing to bring that along.
Well, thank you. Yes, we'll just switch off. Thank you for being with us here today with NCHE, with Joanne Freeman. We're just delighted you could join us. Thank you for being human with us, as Carolee said. It's so important and all the time. All right, so we're switch off the cameras, and we will see you all in the after party or next week. Thank you all so much.
Exactly. Saving the chat as ever.